All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Next slide.
All right, so welcome everyone, and whether you are joining us for the first time today or you're a regular supporter, we're glad that you've joined us. My name is Nessa, and I'm the Director of Engagement here at Generation 180. And for those of you who are just getting to know us, Generation 180 is a nonprofit organization that inspires and equips individuals to take clean energy actions in their homes, their schools, and communities. Next slide, please. We're working to flip the script from a narrative that focuses on climate doom and gloom to one that focuses on solutions and clean energy actions. We have 3 national campaigns: Solar for All Schools, Electrify Your Ride, and electric school buses. We focus on solar and electric vehicles as clean energy solutions that address 2 of the largest sources of carbon emissions: electricity generation and transportation. Our webinar today is part of our Electrify Your Ride campaign that works to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles and break down the barriers to make electric vehicles more accessible for everyone. Next slide, and over to Shakaya to share our agenda and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Nessa. So today we have 4 panelists joining us for our great conversation, by which they'll be sharing upcoming programs, experiences as a renter and EV owner, and the steps it took to bring EV charging to multi-unit dwellings to increase EV access for all. Today we have with us Kate, the Director of Electrification with Dominion Energy, Tim, an agency fleet manager of King County Housing Authority, Aisha, a property manager that is in the DC area, and lastly with us is Brennan, an EV owner that is in the California area. In a moment, they will tell you a little bit about themselves and their background. Please utilize the Q&A section of Zoom as questions arise during our conversation today. And then we'll close out our webinar with resources and actions that can help individuals continue these conversations. Next slide. All right, so for many of you who may be unfamiliar with the term multi-unit dwellings, this term refers to communities that consist of apartments, townhomes, and condo communities. As Generation 180 navigates the conversations that continue to encourage and make EV access accessible for everyone, we have noticed that there can be additional barriers. Whether you're an EV owner that continues to rent but have no access to EV charging in your community, or if you're a property manager or owner that has renters that are EV owners and need access to charging near their residence. Or maybe you are not an EV owner just yet and want those resources to continue the discussions needed to make that transition. Our goal is that today's webinar will provide some perspective, as well as offer resources to everyone, but especially renters or property managers and owners that are ready to start those conversations. Next slide.
So now we're going to move to some questions for and conversations with our panelists. Shakaya and I will start off with some questions. And as you have questions that pop up throughout the webinar, as Shakaya noted, please add them to the Q&A section and we will weave them in.
All right, so starting with you, Tim. All of our panelists have either had professional or personal experience with EV and charging. What has been your experience or perspective in that space?
Tim, you're muted, I believe.
I was unmuted and now I'm muted and now I'm unmuted again. Hi, everybody. I'll start this over again. Thank you for the introduction. So yes, I'm with King County Housing Authority and we're a low-income housing provider here in suburban Seattle, Washington. And we have been installing electric vehicle charging stations for 10 years now. The first one we installed was at our headquarters here in Tukwila, Washington. And then we've been slowly expanding our charging network over the 10 years to include currently, while I was looking a minute ago about trying to count up, we currently have 24 public sites and another 14 private sites, meaning that only our fleet can use the chargers installed so far. It's a pretty large network over King County, which is a large county itself. Our goal is to have charging stations at every one of our properties at some point, hopefully by 2030, but maybe earlier if we can find the financing for it. We also, this is our first year to buy fully electric vehicles. We have 12 electric vans and 1 electric sedan, which I drive as a company car. And so we are looking to hopefully convert our complete fleet to electric or some sort of non-traditional fuel by 2033, but we're also looking at pushing that up to 2030 if possible with financing, of course. We've received a lot of support from senior management here. We couldn't have done it without senior management leadership and support for our endeavor. And I still continue to get that support. But also part of it is we're mandated by Washington state law to have our fleet go to non-traditional fueling. And so we're driven by mandate, but we're also driven by mission to turn our fleet over to non-ICE vehicles, as well as provide opportunities for our residents to charge and staff to charge their vehicles at our sites. So.
Thank you, Tim. How about you, Brennan?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, it says, all of our panelists have professional or personal experience with EV and charging. What has been your experience or perspective in this space?
So I've been mostly an EV driver and EV enthusiast, and kind of like a EV environmental volunteer for quite some time now. I got into EVs as my first car back in 2012. So I basically for a decade now I haven't been daily driving a gas-powered vehicle, and initially it was really the technology and the immediate emissions reductions that really kind of got me into EVs. I grew up in LA, not the cleanest air in the world, even even by the 90s and 2000s, with a lot of emissions reductions from gas cars. The air quality was still pretty bad. So when electric cars started becoming a thing, and they became a thing very early in LA, we had EVs in the late 90s in LA, and so I kind of grew up with it a little bit, and so it felt like an obvious choice, and I was lucky that I was able to get into it at that time, and ever since I've just kind of fallen in love with it.
Sounds good. How about you, Aisha?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? First off, I'm in an environment with a little bit of background noise. Okay, great. So my experience and perspective with EV charging comes both as an electric vehicle driver rather, as well as being interested as a property manager of multifamily properties in the DC metro region. I recently had a experience and opportunity where I was going to work with a company that received a grant through our DOEE, Department of Energy and the Environment, and that grant was supposed to subsidize me installing an electric vehicle charger at a 12 unit that I own and manage in the Deanwood neighborhood of Northeast DC, which is a lower socioeconomic community. And so that is my space that I work in, providing housing, whether it be preserving or constructing housing for our lower wage earners. And so I'm interested in bringing electric vehicle charging to the lower socioeconomic communities for the health reasons, for even the aesthetics. There are a lot of affordable electric vehicles now that people in our community, perhaps if we saw the infrastructure more, we would be more inclined to look at an electric vehicle. So I feel like my perspective spans 3 areas, I would say: a driver, a multifamily housing provider, and then also as a property manager for managing my own properties and then others that I may build or acquire to preserve. So thank you for having me, especially to Shakaya, who did great with following up and including me. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much for being a part of it. And lastly, Kate, how about you?
Thanks, Shakaya. I'm Kate Staples. I'm the Director of Electrification at Dominion Energy. I live in Richmond, Virginia. I live in a single family home now, but I used to live in a quadplex, and my parents still live in a duplex. So there's still quite a bit of multifamily dwelling experience that I've had in the recent past at being an EV driver. And so my experience comes from being an EV driver, but also from working at Dominion. We have been working with, a few years ago, it was customers coming to us, drivers that were interested in having EV charging installed at their apartment or condominium association and needed help with where to start. But now we're getting more questions from property owners, which is great. I feel like that means that we're able to kind of flip the script and make some more progress.
All right, thank you, everyone. And it's exciting to see and know that you're all part of the EV transition. So Brennan, you spoke a little bit to why you decided to go to electric in 2012. And so at that time, was access to charging a consideration for you? Or what steps have you taken then or since then to make sure you've been able to charge your EV?
Yeah, well, it's funny with, back then, I just really wanted the car. So I just kind of bought it and didn't think about where I was going to charge it. But to my delight, I found out that, just like your laptop, you can just charge it on a regular wall outlet. And at the time I was living in a situation where I had access to a wall outlet. And the other funny thing too is, there are a lot less public chargers back then, but there were also a lot less EVs, and most of the public chargers were free. So at the mall, I could always just charge the car at museums, etc. So, in the first few years, it was just not really a thought, ironically, even though, road trips were a different story. I spent a lot of time at RV campgrounds, charging up overnight instead of being able to fast charge and that kind of thing. But, in the city, it wasn't actually much of an issue. But I'm lucky being in California where we had that infrastructure pretty early on.
Great. And next question will be for you, Aisha. And I know you touched on this a little bit in your introduction, but just as a multi-unit property manager, can you talk to a little bit of what did the evaluation look like early on? I know you talked about possible grants that you could apply for, but what did that evaluation look like to add that EV charging to your property? And what made you start that process? Was it all due to the possible access to local funds? Was it, do you have some tenants that are requesting it? I know you've also mentioned that you're an EV owner as well. And so could you talk to that a little bit as well?
Sure. So the initial interest was just being an EV driver and understanding the benefits that go along with that, and then wanting to transition my properties into more of sustainability aspects. So for instance, where we're installing the EV charger, we're also installing an urban farm and solar panels. So I saw EV charging as being another amenity that we can offer by way of sustainability in these lower socioeconomic communities where our projects can actually be considered models even for bringing certain value add things to the community that are profitable, which then goes into the evaluation piece. The profit versus installation, for me at the time, that barrier really was something that made me not go forward with it, considering the analysis that the company offered and how much they thought that the EV charging station would produce. It didn't quite make sense for what we're doing at the time. From my understanding, the DOEE grant was for about $7,000, which was, we were grateful for that. But at the 12 unit, it was going to require some digging. Because we have the solar panels coming, we already have meters, the apartment building is separately metered. So there were some considerations that had to be made as far as power supply to the station that ended up, I feel like, making it unaffordable for that particular scenario. Sorry. However, because of our location in Deanwood, we're sort of at the mouth of 295 and Eastern Avenue. And so back to the initial thought, I figured, okay, we could be a stopping point for folks that are traveling through the city. However, by us where we're located, it didn't make for the most desirable location for someone to come off the highway to charge. That could have helped us with the income part. That could have helped with the offsetting of the initial cost. So, there were different factors that went into saying, okay, let's do this. And then once we got deeper into the evaluation of it, it didn't quite feel like it would be the best idea to do the EV charging station at this point. But we are still interested. We do still feel like it's a good idea.
All right, thank you. So Tim, could you tell us a little bit more about the properties that you work with and whether they were built EV charging ready or whether charging was added to those properties?
So with two exceptions, all of our properties did not have any sort of EV infrastructure at all. Had to start from scratch. And there have been challenges at every property, whether it be the power source or the route from the power source to the parking or the parking. There have been properties where I've had to walk away from because the challenges to install the station were too expensive, basically. I've always joked if money was no option, I'd have charging stations everywhere already. But because I'm on a budget, but my budget's been growing over the years, as I said, as their upper management realizes the value of this. I've been adding more money to my budget, which has been great. So I have a ability to put in a few more stations. I've been averaging about 5 stations a year. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's my budget. And what's interesting is that when we have gone in and bought properties and have done major rehabilitation, talking about tens of millions of dollars of work, the local municipalities are requiring us to put in EV charging infrastructure. So new, if you want to call it new construction, but a major rehabilitation, we're adding the EV infrastructure already. So that's great. Although I've been having to bug our project managers and engineers about, hey, don't forget about electric vehicles, because and I've actually had to do some consulting with the architects and engineers on where to not put stations. They tend to want to just plop them anywhere, and you just can't do that. There's ADA issues involved, access issues. So we're slowly but surely adding charging. And as I said, as we build new or major renovation, we're required by municipalities to add it anyway. So.
Great. Yeah, and I think it makes a big difference. You are an EV owner, you've been working in this space, and for someone who may be coming at it for the first time or from the outside, they don't take all of those details into consideration. So that's interesting to hear, and also noted the challenges that you're up against. So as a follow-up question, it sounds like many of the properties were not EV ready, and so you worked to bring that transition. So how did you or those properties decide to allocate the additional costs? Was it across the board for all tenants? Was it by EV owner? Yeah, could you share with us a little bit what that looked like?
It's really, we've approached it pretty simply. I have a budget where most of my budget comes from, ironically, the state of Washington's sales tax rebate we get for gasoline purchases. So I'm taking gas tax money and using it to build electric vehicle infrastructure, which is kind of an irony in a way, but that money is there for me to go and install the stations. The cost of the electricity at the site is we just absorb the cost. It's just another cost to our operating expenses, and so we just absorb the cost there. We don't allocate or charge our tenants for anything. Our stations are public stations, meaning that they have to pay to use them. We're not allowed by law as a public agency to give away free electricity. So we have to charge tenants electricity use at our stations, and those rates are set by the station providers. We use Blink and we use green lots, mostly Blink, but some green lots as well. And so our tenants are paying for whatever those charges are. For Blink, it's 39 cents an hour if you're a member. Which, you think about it, if you want to fully charge your Nissan Leaf, you're going to spend maybe $2-3 to do it. So it's awesome versus our almost $6 a gallon gas here in Seattle. So yeah, in California, you all know that as well. So that's how we do it. We just absorb the cost of electricity, and then we have our tenants pay for the use per their membership with whatever provider they're using.
Thank you. All helpful information. This question's for you, Kate. Dominion Energy is launching a new multi-unit dwelling electrification program. Can you tell us more about this program and why Dominion decided to focus on this space? I know you mentioned early on that the conversations have started before now, but if you could touch a little bit on that.
Sure, exactly. So we decided to focus on the space because we are having demand from our customers in that space. But also, if we're really serious about decarbonizing transportation, our Clean Cities organization had some statistics showing that upwards of 40% of people don't park within 10 feet of an outlet. So, and a lot of those folks are in multi-unit dwellings. And so we needed to be able to have solutions for that segment if we really want to help those customers as they seek to electrify their vehicles. So we've had some rebate programs in the past, and those have been successful. Rebates are great, but what we've heard from customers is that they need more help getting the charging, getting to the install. So a lot of the things that that Tim and Brennan talked about, talking with your homeowners association, how do you allocate costs? How do you get things installed? How do you decide who needs to charge when? And can you use just the outlet or the cord that comes with it? Do you really need a level 2 charger? All of those logistics, folks are having trouble getting through that noise to be able to get their charging station in. So the program that we're launching soon, we actually have an interest form on our website right now. Dominion Energy will help do all of that work and will install and maintain the charging station for the multi-unit community, whether it's a condo association or apartment association, if that's something that they want us to do.
And I think a follow-up question, and maybe either you, Kate, or Tim can answer this question, but is there a certain calculation used to determine the number of chargers needed based on the number of tenants or maybe the number of EVs that are in a particular community?
I can start. Some jurisdictions in Virginia have it in their have suggestions maybe in their building code or in their permitting, but there isn't really a hard and fast rule. What we recommend is if you're gonna do the work to put one in, you should at least do the conduit wiring, what we call the make ready. You should at least do that for the other stations as well. So if you have 80 parking spots, you don't need to put in 80 chargers, but you could put in electrical infrastructure to support a higher percentage of those.
So we have not had a formula so far. Basically, my goal was at least one station per site. Our sites vary in size, varying from a couple dozen residents to hundreds of residents. But we're looking at a formula for one station for every 100 residents. It's an arbitrary number, I know, but we wanted to start with something. So I have been tasked by my supervisor to come up with a plan based upon that formula. What do we need to do to make sure that there's one station for every 100 residents? So that's our start.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. So we are going to start rolling to some of the Q&A that's coming in and try to weave those in. It looks like there are a number of questions from our audience members, which is great. So Aisha and Tim, this one is for you. Have either of you looked at federal IRA funding, Inflation Reduction Act funding for your developments? And or are there, is there state funding that you're aware of? And Aisha, in your case, District of Columbia. So you kind of bookend the nation. Any input on that question there? Aisha, let's start with you and then go over to Tim.
Sure. So I am very new to discovering funding in this space, but with DC's aggressive initiatives toward being a more sustainable city, they have put in a number of support systems. One of them, one major support system that I'm actually working with funding for 3 projects right now is DC Green Bank. They were created in 2019 to basically fund energy efficiency projects in some sort of way. So I'm working closely with them. And then we also have DCSEU, which is the DC electric utility, the S, sustainable electric utility. I'm not sure, but the acronym is DC, S is in Sam, E is in Edward, U is in Union. They actually offer rebates and different opportunities. And I think if they don't already have an EV charging solution, they'll likely start to move into that space because they also offer education. So I am still learning about all of the resources. I kind of started with solar. We're putting solar on our various projects. And so understanding how solar plays into the EV charging and how that plays into battery storage space, it's really been an educational time for me. So I'm hoping that I want to hear, what else everybody else has going on. And then I did mention the DOE grant. That's a big deal right now here in the city as well. And actually, we had something to come up here recently, and I'm going to look it up just to make sure I speak on it properly. And then once everybody else speaks, I'll circle back around and kind of share the latest program.
All right, and then we had another
Tim,
question.
I think Tim was going to answer.
As far as grants go, yes, we're always looking for money. We are going to explore the recent Biden infrastructure, the IRA. I hate that acronym, bill. And we also are a recipient of a couple of grants for developing EV rideshare programs, like a flex car, but using electric vehicle. So we've got that rolling out over the next few months. We have a resource conservation team that I asked them to look for grants because that's what they do. They're supposed to go out and find green grants for us. I'm pretty busy dealing with day-to-day fleet operations. I don't really have time to go explore where grants are at. So that's what I asked them to do. I have looked at grants in the past for charging stations and have turned them down because the conditions were too onerous or we just couldn't meet them, whether it be financially or other obligations. They were just not going to work for us. So I have turned down grants as well if they're not going to work for us. But we're always looking for money, and hopefully we will be able to get a large infusion of cash from the Biden bill that came through, and that should be able to help accelerate our goal to get our stations installed before 2030, which is kind of our current goal.
And so we had another question came in, and maybe Kate, you could speak to this a little bit. It says, what can we do to promote legislation that would require changes to the building code requiring all parking lots to have X amount of setup EV charging? And then we'll go to you, Aisha, after.
So where we've seen that be successful is, starting with your stakeholder groups that are active in those building code negotiations. So think about like your home builders associations, your environmental groups, your IBEW, your electrician groups, folks like that, because those are the ones who are going to be impacted. And so you'll want to make sure that they understand the benefits. And so then when a patron or a legislator is able to support the inclusion of that in building code, you'll have a good stakeholder support for pushing that through. And also making sure you have a good timeline. It takes a while to get these things incorporated, so making sure that you have a good timeline to allow that to take place.
Great. And Aisha, you had raised your hand. Did you want to chime in there?
Yes, back to the funding, that initial question. So on October 19th, actually DC announced funding through the Department of Transportation They're being awarded $16.6 million in federal funding to build the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. And the funding is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation's National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. The acronym is N Nancy E Edward V Victor I Igloo. So through the NEVI formula program, we're getting 16.6 million, and that's actually through DDOT, which is, an obvious agency that, we can probably look to funding here in the city as well.
Great, thank you for noting that, Aisha. And I believe that all states have had the opportunity and have applied for NEVI funding, National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funding. So yeah, definitely a great thing for folks to check out in their own state. So if I can ask a little bit, and I'm not sure who might be the best one, but chime in if you have an answer. Just kind of wondering about the kind of, what is the average retrofit cost per charging space? Especially if you're, if a multi-unit dwelling or space has already been constructed and you're making it EV charging ready.
I'll start. So the folks that are on this call, we're all in different parts of the country. So costs vary across the country. Costs also vary based on whether you have concrete or asphalt, or you're on a parking deck with a drop ceiling. So those costs vary a lot. But we've seen some reports out there that estimate that for each charger that you're gonna, the costs for not utility upgrades, but to put in the infrastructure is gonna be, we've seen anywhere between $2,000 and $5,000 a charger. Now that can, again, it can vary significantly based on the kind of infrastructure you're dealing with. Now, but as you add more chargers, that goes down. So if you're gonna put in 3 chargers, you may be looking at, $2,000 to $5,000 a charger, but if you're going to put in 30, that number is going to go down per charger. So you get some economies of scale there. I don't know if any of the other experts on the phone in other parts of the country have had other experience.
Yeah, I can add to that, Kate. So again, I have a 12-unit building. We had a 9 space parking lot. It was recommended that we do 2 stations, and once the infrastructure folks did, because the larger company was working with a more local company that came out and actually did the walk around. And so after they did that and determined how they would have to run the conduit and so forth, it was about $19,000 that I would have had to come out of pocket. So your number, Kate, is about right, especially considering that we would have had to dig underground. And because we had something from Verizon that was running near, we just got files ready in the community. And so my cost ended up being about $19,000. And just also to add to my earlier point about the location where we initially thought we were well situated because we were at 295 in Eastern, the other component that made it a little less compelling is the speed of charging. It wasn't a supercharger, so now you're talking about, a lengthy time with really nothing to do in the community. And quite frankly, if you're not familiar, you're not familiar. So it's not necessarily somewhere where you want to sit if you're unfamiliar or, may have some anxieties about being in the lower socioeconomic community.
Yeah. Tim, anything you wanted to add here on price for retrofit that you're seeing?
So we have our charging stations themselves range anywhere from a few $100s to about $3,000, depending on what I'm buying. The labor, time and material cost per site is wildly varied, as Kate said, but we're averaging between $5,000 and $10,000 a site. And my sort of cutoff is $10,000 if the cost of the labor is going to be more than, if you add the charging station and the labor, it's more than $10,000, I typically will walk. That was back in the past when my budget was more limited. Now with all this infusion of new money coming in, I may be more tolerant to go higher up as far as a per site cost goes, but basically my limit's been 10,000 and less.
Great, thanks, Tim. And Brennan, just to kind of like take it home to the EV drivers and the EV owners, as you've kind of charged at a variety of places, whether it's been where you lived or a property across town or stores, what are you seeing and or paying for a charge for your car to fill up?
Yeah, so there are kind of two ways to do it. You can DC fast charge, or you can level 2 charge. DC fast chargers are the most convenient. A lot of grocery stores have them. You show up 30 minutes later, you're at 80%, and then, you're good for the next few days, depending on how much you drive. The issue with DC fast chargers is they're a bit more expensive. And, it's not like gas right now. It's more like $2.50 a gallon equivalent kind of situation. So I, prefer to level 2 charge because it's a little bit healthier for the battery, but also it's a lot less expensive. It's more closer to residential, closer to that like $1.50 a gallon equivalent, cost. Largely, I think the biggest challenge with a lot of level 2 is that they're not really treated like gas stations. And so they're not always 24 hours, or it's ambiguous, or they're like selectively enforced. And, there's a good example across the street from where I live. There was a, nice brand new shopping center with a huge bank of chargers. And, the lights are on all night. There are no gates. You can drive in and out of the garage. And many people leave their EVs there overnight. But then they have signs everywhere that says no overnight parking. So it's one of those things where you don't really know what the rules are. You don't know who they're towing and who they're not. I never got in trouble, but it's that kind of thing where for level 2, I wish that there was, property managers would make it more clear what the use case is, because if you're going to charge me money to use level 2, making it for like customers only seems a little odd, because then I'm a customer if I'm buying electricity. So I guess that's my comment on that. But again, largely it's not, in California, it's not been too bad. And if you are daytime charging while you're shopping, it's not an issue at all.
Great, Brennan. I think an additional question for you as an EV owner is, in your community, or, I know you mentioned just different access to charging. Have you found that a lot of the residents in that community have asked questions about what does the charging look like for you as an EV owner? Are there a lot of other tenants that are EV owners in that community as well? Can you kind of talk to what that experience is, or just the experience overall with charging, or finding the options to charge?
Yeah, so again, I live in the Bay Area of California, so a lot of my neighbors have EVs, and not all of us have home charging. In the apartment complex, there's at least 5 or 6 other EVs, and in conversations I've had with my neighbors and friends who have EVs, a lot of them work for companies that provide charging at work, and so that's, I think, where they charge primarily. It's interesting. I know people who even have single family homes in this area who could charge at home, but because they can charge at work, they just do that. So I think that's kind of the primary thing. And then other than that, people are going to local DC fast chargers and that kind of thing. The property management company that owned the apartment where I lived did have another apartment down the street that they put in a couple level 2 chargers, and that was pretty great. But I think there are only like 2 ports, and so they either get full, or if you get it, and you kind of feel bad for leaving your car there because there's a line. So I think that is another kind of aspect of it. It's nice to have the charging at all at your complex, but to be able to have enough of them so that you're not waking up at 3 a.m. to move your car for the next person, that kind of thing.
All right, so I'm under the impression that you all have been in this space for a bit of time, right? You've been working in this space, and you've had to learn and adjust, and things keep changing and evolving a bit. So do you all who are a bit tried and true in this space, do you have any recommendations to help existing property managers or owners, or like, people who are just starting to explore this space and add chargers to multi-dwelling units? Do you have any good recommendations or things that they should consider as they start to go into this space?
Okay, I always forget to unmute myself. First consideration is, do you have the electrical power supply in your panel to do it? If you don't have the power, you can't install a station. So the first thing is, do you have enough juice, as I say, to power your charging station and be safe with it, not to be on the edge of like, well, we think we can squeeze in this extra 5 amps and be okay. It's electricity. You don't want to play with that stuff. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing is the location of the parking to the power source. Basically, it's like, how far away is it? Because I've learned the further away the power source, the more expensive the project. So if you can get a parking spot as close to your power source as possible, that's a bonus. And if you can avoid things like trenching under sidewalks or parking lots, that also is something that you should consider as well. And then lastly, I think you have to consider ADA issues, or the cords of the charging stations are going to cross over where somebody might trip, or somebody with a wheelchair can't get through. So you have to consider the ADA as well. So those are some of my tips.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? All right. Over to you, Shapaya.
Okay, so we had one more question come in, and maybe Tim or Kate or even Aisha, you could weigh in on this. And so the question is, should all new construction require to add charging? What is the incremental cost in adding charging stations or reciprocals to multi-unit dwellings? Some EJ communities have complained that this raises the cost of ICE vehicle drivers, which essentially, who has to pay for the PEV drivers?
I'll go first because I feel like my response will be brief. In regard to actually, Tim, let me let you go first, and I'll piggyback on yours.
So the question is, should this be required for? Because yeah, I mean, a lot of our local municipalities already require electric charging infrastructure to be installed, and so we're having to comply with that, which is fine. We're not complaining. So we're already seeing it here in the Seattle area that it's being required. And does it add cost? When you build it into the project initially, the cost is a lot less than if you come in afterwards and try to install it later on. So definitely from a cost perspective, it's better to design it initially and install it initially. Definitely. As far as subsidizing drivers, well, I mean, we can go to arguments on how much automobile drivers ICE cars are subsidized by other people for what they did. So you can get into that argument all day long on who's subsidizing who and where and what. But basically, it's a cost of doing business for us, and we don't want to add any cost to any of our tenants as far as them subsidizing another. But we don't pass on the slight increase of electrical cost that we see per se. We don't pass that on to anybody. We just absorb the cost and move on.
And so thank you for that feedback, Tim. I was trying to make sure that I had it in the right order. So that was my advice, that to try to do the projects that we do have in the pipeline that involve construction, that those might be a little more viable because we can incorporate the EV charging into the plans as we're digging up the ground or doing whatever that will be needed on the site. And so for me, being small, I'd be looking to really pair with still another larger agency so I can get some kind of grant funding to incorporate it into the newer construction projects. And I don't have a particular plan to pass any charges on, certainly not to the residents, being that my residential model is, lower income. However, we are looking at ways and ideas to incorporate our solar energy into the whole power play. And so that'll take a little more investigation and research, but we are considering that.
Kate, any bits that you want to add for that question?
So we've seen it done a lot of different ways. And a lot of charging stations out there have a lot of functionality and bells and whistles that allow you to offer, pricing or limit access. But those charging stations are often a little bit more expensive than just kind of a standard, I hate to call it this dumb outlet, but something without a lot of bells and whistles. So I think you really need to weigh the cost benefit there. So, if it really is important for maintaining, for being able to get the infrastructure in and being able to maintain it, that you're able to get that cost recovery from tenants, then maybe you need that type of infrastructure. So that's something that I would encourage folks to consider. The other thing that we've talked to some folks about is some housing, especially if it's city, county, or state-owned housing. They have cycles in which they redo paving or they redo certain other projects. And so if you could kind of get that into the planning cycle, sometimes that can help with costs as well.
All right, thanks. So Brendan, you mentioned that at the beginning, back when you first bought an EV, you were so excited about it and you didn't take into consideration kind of the charging, and now here we are a decade later, and things have evolved a bit. So at this point in time, how valuable is it for you to have a charger either at your residence or very close by that you have regular access to?
Yeah, I think it's very valuable, primarily because you don't have to think about it as much. It's just there. You can just plug in, but I think you get the same value if, you have charging at your workplace or charging very close by, within like a couple blocks, and that you can leave your car there and you're not feeling pressured to move it right away. So, I still think that, if anything, we have more options. You just have to be a little bit more prepared. But I think, the technology we have now makes that really easy. A lot of cars have in their own navigation systems, they tell you where all the chargers are. You should everyone should get the PlugShare app. I don't work for them, but they are great. Especially when you first move to a new area, it's really useful because it's crowdsourced. So they'll tell you, I had XYZ experience here, and this station's really good, or this station is really well lit up at night, or et cetera, et cetera. So.
All great information. Okay, so we have 2 more questions for our panelists. And this next question is going to be, what successes have you seen or heard about for individuals seeking EV charging within their community? And so we'll start with you, Tim.
What successes have I seen? Well, I mean, it's kind of a cliche, right? It's if you build it, they will come kind of thing. And that's been my attitude all along when people are going, well, these are low income people. They can't afford electric cars. Why are we putting in these stations? And I go, if you put the stations in, the cars start showing up because people realize that they could charge at their home. That's going to incentivize them to maybe buy an electric vehicle. And you can find used electric vehicles now, an older Leaf for $10,000, $12,000, which is in a reasonable price range for a lower income person. And so basically, we started seeing electric cars just starting to pop up at our properties that weren't there before. And also we have about a half our housing is called workforce housing. So they actually have to do marketing to get people to, well, maybe not in the Seattle area so much because housing is such a demand here, but we're starting to use electric vehicle charging as a marketing tool as well. so that, hey, come live with us. You can charge your car because you're a renter, and we don't say you're a renter, but you're renting and you don't have access to a charger in most places that you rent, but here you do. So come on by and move in with us. So that's kind of how we're looking at it, is if you build it, they'll show up. They really do. And to add to what Brandon was saying, yes, I also drive an electric vehicle, a Nissan Leaf, a company car, and I don't have a way to charge at home. I live in a triplex. I'm a renter. So I depend on my work here to have charging stations to be available. Unfortunately, sometimes those charging stations are not available because they're all being used. And so I have to go to a DC fast charger a half mile down the road to charge. But I'm just glad that the network is there for me to use. And if you continue to build it, I believe more people will switch to these vehicles.
How about you, Kate?
A lot of the success that we've seen is when tenants talk with their homeowners association and maybe understand their process for undergoing new projects. And if somebody had mentioned the kind of right to charge legislation, you know, that's certainly out there and that does help. But maybe trying to help do some of that legwork for the homeowners association, giving them some recommendations and helping to mitigate some of their questions, maybe finding other properties that have gone through a similar installation so they can provide examples, and giving them kind of realistic expectations on costs, because this is something that is going to be there for some years. So it's not just kind of a one-time thing, and it's something that they as the driver, you may be thinking this is kind of your one thing you're thinking about, but as the association or as the property manager, you may be thinking about the roof, maintenance, groundskeeping, all kinds of things that are going on. So making sure that you're really aligning with your stakeholders.
How about you, Aisha or Brennan?
I think there's a lot of value to having the charger where you live. I think that for me, it's essential. Basically, we've installed a faster charger at home. So that's been really convenient. Occasionally, we still have to do it, when we're out and about traveling. As far as bringing it to the community and my communities right now, as far as the multifamily world, I have not seen them. I do think they're popping up more here in DC. I just haven't seen them yet, and I certainly haven't seen them in Deanwood. Again, we were looking to be one of the front runners, if you will, with bringing that technology to the lower socioeconomic community. And even listening here today, it makes me maybe want to reconsider, because the future thinking. I don't know of a law right now in DC that requires EV charging for new developments, but perhaps it's coming. And so being a developer, that's something that I really want to make sure it's in mind and top of mind for our newer developments, to be on the front end of things.
Anything to add, Brennan?
Well, I'll just say it was a pretty cool feeling that first night that I pulled up the charger at the property management company that owned my apartment, and that it was on, it was working, and me and another EV driver were able to charge. So that feeling of suddenly, like, oh wow, I have this really convenient thing, it's right there, and then there's it really makes you feel good about your purchase decision.
All right, all great answers. Thank you guys for your time today, for answering the questions. Thank you for our attendees. If we could go ahead back to the slide real quick and we will close it out. All right, so this slide is providing some resources, which Jamie will pop the URL links in our chat for you. But these resources for everyone. And so basically our EV resource libraries provided by Generation 180. In addition, you'll see the VCI MUD reference. That is one of our partners prepared that website, and it's a plethora of resources there around multi-unit dwellings for both tenants and property managers and owners to start those or continue those conversations. And then lastly, our last call to action is if you're not yet an EV owner and you would like to pledge to make your next car electric, you have that opportunity to do so. Next slide. Again, thank you everyone for attending the webinar today, as well as a special thank you to our panelists, Kate, Tim, Aisha, and Brennan for their time and input in today's conversation. It was great. And you will see on the slide my contact information. So if you have any follow-up questions or comments after today's webinar, please reach out. Everyone have a wonderful day.